All right. So,
Are you recording?
Yes, it's recording.
okay. So I'm gonna try to bring it around to, I would say, an organized, charted direction. But I wanna speak before I talk. I think you have to mute everybody, Eliel.
Oh, I see.
I can't do it.
Yeah, I'm doing it right now.
Okay.
You can't mute me. I'm muting myself.
Okay. The host, and I'm okay. I can speak.
Yeah.
Okay. Very good. Fine. So what I want to talk about is it's going to be one of two classes, and I want to talk about Mumrim, the concept of Mumrim, their effect on Klal Yisrael. I want to profile specific Mumrim, and then I want to talk about their direct effect on censorship and what we have in terms of residuals from their activity in the Shas, in the basic Sfarim. I would like to also show a few items and give a little bit of an understanding of what some of these items are and were affected by. So I'll do that a little later in the discussion. I want to give a little bit of Akdama. I want to just talk about the basic idea of when people are on the wrong path. I remember a line, when you have a point and it's a bit weak. So Rabbi Soloveitchik from Boston used to say, weak points scream louder. The yelling helps to internalize and to be mechazik you in your errant path, and it makes you feel much more confident with the foolhardy position that you've taken. So we find that in many areas, and specifically in apostasy and mumrim. One of the interesting, I would say, examples is in the area of predictions and apocalyptic eschatological events, where many, many different people over the course of the last 2,000 years have predicted the end of the world, either through a comet or through a coming of JC, or messianic end of the world, or through some global, trauma that will destroy the world. And it's interesting to watch the followers of these individuals. For example, recently in our time, I remembered a couple of years ago, I'm sure some of you remembered, Harold Camping was the father and host of a radio ministry based in California. He was quite charismatic. He seemed to live a rather pious life. And towards the end of his life, he was in his 80s. He started predicting the end of the world, and he did it with such definition and with such certainty. He started in 1994. He reevaluated the prediction in 2011 and then in 2013. That means he had 3 strikes, and in each time he was wrong. In 1994, he predicted with great definition, he was a man in his 70s, that the world would end through a catastrophic earthquake. It would leave approximately 200 million people in the world, and those would be the faithful, and they would witness the coming of JC. He was wrong, but his supporters just doubled down, as did he. His ministry grew. It was an amazing thing to watch. His ministry grew, and it became a multi-million-dollar enterprise after that. In 2011, again, he predicted the same thing, only to watch his ministry grow time after time after time. It seems to me that when people engage in a fallacy, those that follow them, together with them, they just double down, and they get deeper and deeper, more entrenched in this crazy prediction that they sort of advanced on the world. Another interesting guy was the Church of God, was Ronald Weiland, who also was involved in many false predictions. I forgot how many. He was a tax fraud. He started predicting from jail. It was very interesting. After each time that he went off, each time that he was wrong, he ended up doubling his followers. He ended up getting more money. It seems that the wrong predictions didn't affect them at all, not their stability and confidence, nor the people that believed in them. Very interesting and fascinating to me. Someone has to study what exactly happens in the human mind when they see it's wrong, but I would say this is something that might even be found in Anshe Shloimenu, when great men predict and they're wrong. It only makes the Chassidim believe that they're not Roy, but the Rebbe really saw something, or the Rav really saw something. Now this idea is is a very, I would say, pervasive concept in mumrim and mumrus, in apostasy and apostates. I want to just couch it in a very nice, I would say, teaching from Sefer Yirmiyahu. It's a slight digression, but I think it's a valuable digression. I'd like to just show in Yirmiyahu Chavches, there was a Navi. Yirmiyahu was quite young at the time. According to some, Yirmiyahu started prophesying at the age of 13. He was very young. He was Terem Etzorcha Babeten Yedaticha. He was selected as a prophet of God from very young. And maybe, if you're allowed to say it, maybe he was even less secure at this point in his life. From Chavches to Perek Lamed Hey, Lamed Vav, Lamed Zayin, many years pass in Yirmiyahu's life. He's predicting towards the beginning of the destruction of Bayis Rishon, and he's predicting that the Bayis is going to be destroyed for 70 years. He comes up against an older, I would say much more charismatic Navi than himself. Those that want to know about Yirmiyahu's charisma should just look in the Abarbanel's Hakdama to Sefer Yirmiyahu and the Malbim's, I would say, massacre against Abarbanel. In any event, Yirmiyahu comes and confronts Hanani ben Azur. Eli, you have to just keep muting as more people arrive. I think it just Hanani sees Yirmiyahu walking with yokes of wood, and those were symbols to the yokes that Hashem placed on the neck of Klal Yisrael, and those yokes are going to be there for 70 years. And Hanani gets upset and he says, Koyamar Hashem tzvokos Elokei Yisrael, Shavarti es oil melech Bavel. Hanani takes those yokes, he breaks them. And as a symbol, he says, no, these yokes are incorrect. Hashem said, I broke the yokes of Melech Bavel. And from here on, it's going to be upward, and it's going to be a trend to Geula. And don't worry, Yechanya ben Yoyakim Melech Yehuda is going to come back. Everybody's going to come back. And Yirmiyahu is staggered. He knows this is a Navi Sheker. Chazal tell us that Hanani ben Azur wasn't quite the Navi Sheker that we think he was. He had abilities, he had certain understandings, but he wasn't yet defined as a Navi. He might have been classified as the Bnei HaNevi'im. But he jumped the gun and went ahead of what he was supposed to, and he ends up actually being misnabe l'sheker. So now he's definitely in the pale of rishus. And Yirmiyahu is watching what's happening, and slowly he sees Hanani commandeering all of Klal Yisrael with this good message that's not really deserving. They're not supposed to have a good message. They're supposed to be pushed towards tshuva. And he says, Hanani, he stops him right there. He says, listen, when a Navi prophesies something good, then if it doesn't come true, he will be known to be a Navi Sheker. But when a Navi prophesies something bad, the Rabbani Shalom could have charata. The Rabbani Shalom could accept that tshuva. So you should know what you did right now was you locked yourself into a test that will clearly show whether you're good or not good. I didn't. And then he goes on to say, according to the Medrash Haggadah, he says, and you should know, what's your rush to have binyan abayis? You come from Givainim. When the bayis gets erected, you're going to go back to be a shoyev mayim and a chaytzav eitzim. What's your rush? I'm a kohen. I should be ecstatic with this nevuah. But Hanani continues. And then Yirmiyahu says a prediction. He says, and you should know, because you started up with the Rabbi Shalom and with the Rabbi Shalom's Navi, he says, Shmano Hananya, lo yishlochacha Hashem, v'ato yiftachta es ha'omazeh al sheker. You promised falsely, lo chein, koyomar Hashem. You'll die this year. You'll die this year. It's an unbelievable prophecy. You're going to die this year. And Chazal tell us something, because the next pasuk says, "Vayomas Hananya hanavi b'shana hi b'chodesh hashvi." So the Yerushalmi in Sanhedrin says like this. It's medayik from the pasuk. B'shana hi b'chodesh hashvi. B'shana hi. So Hanani and Yirmiyahu had this altercation Nisan time. They had this altercation Nisan time. And Rosh Hashanah, by Rosh Hashanah, Hanani was supposed to die, because that's Hashanah Hi. The end of the year is Rosh Hashanah. If we count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, at the end of 6, it's Rosh Hashanah, and that's the end of the year. Hanani was supposed to die Rosh Hashanah. But it says, B'chodesh Hashvi, he died into Tishrei. He didn't die in Elul. The Yerushalmi says that what happened over here is that Hanani told his children, he says it's Rosh Hashanah night. He's advancing Rosh Hashanah, and he tells him, listen, Yirmiyah is a Navi Emes. As young as he is, he's a Navi Emes. I will be dead when you guys come home from shul. But he was mashbiah them. He says, but I'm asking you, foil him and show him to be a shakran. Don't let anybody know about my death till 2 days after Rosh Hashanah. So it should look very clearly like he was a shakran. By Yomas Bashonahi, the pasuk tells us he did die. He died in Elul. He died before Rosh Hashanah. But they hid him till Chodesh Hashvi in order to show everybody that Yirmiyah was a shakran. Rishoim al filu al pischon shel gehenim einam chayzrim. When a person arches himself into a toast, when a person commits himself to an idea, to a position, he's never having a second thought. You're never going to convince somebody with the strength of your argument and the force of your conviction to back off something he's arched his back on. Now, here's the staggering thing. Many years later, Hanani has a son. Hanani's son is Yeriyo. Hanani has a grandson. It's in Pasuk. It's in Pasuk. This is a Medrash Agoda. It's in Pasuk. 1 second. It's in Perek Lamed Zayin of Yirmiyah, and it's in Pasuk Yud Gimel. Yirmiyah is beleaguered beyond what we could understand as people, and it says that every time he did something, they suspected him as being a spy. They suspected him as being somebody who's an informant. So it says, "Vayetze Yirmiyah Yerushalayim lelechas leEretz Binyamin." Lachlik misham b'seicham. He wanted to move in between the nation. He went to Eretz Binyamin. Vayihihu b'shar Binyamin. He gets to the Shar Binyamin. B'sham Baal Pekidus. There's the gatekeeper. I like this word Baal Pekidus. I want to share a thought with you for a second. But there's the gatekeeper. Ushmai Yiriyahu ben Shlemya ben Hananya. Who's this? This is a grandson of Hanani ben Azor. The guy who Yirmiyahu killed many years ago, this is his grandson. Yiriyahu ben Shlemya ben Hananya. Vayitvoises Yirmiyahu anavi lamer elakastem at the neufel, elakastem at the neufel. He got him. He had a whole crowd. They all encircle Yirmiyahu. He says, "I got you. Evidence. It's clear that you're going to the enemy." Rashi brings down a Medrash Agoda that Hanani's family was hell-bent on trying to figure out how to trap Yirmiyahu. Now, Yirmiyahu never got a chance, Shlemya never got a chance, but Yirmiyahu finally got a chance. He saw him at the gate. He ambushed him. He had many people there. They put him in a jail. He almost dies. Yirmiyahu almost dies from this attack. Because such was the hate and such was the devotion and commitment to the false path, that not only did Hanani die a sinner in a sinful way, obfuscating real nevuah, taking away from Klal Yisrael the knowledge and the understanding that there was a real Navi over here, but he commanded his kids who stood strong in that path of Sheker, Yirmiyahu, Shlemya, and that, I like the word Baal Pekidus. I think it's not stam a mikra that the word Baal Pekidus, it's Yafked HaMelech Pekidim, it's Poka Desara. There's a long memory over here. The word Pekidus over here is to say, listen, it's payback. Kan motza balchayv mokem ligbois is chayvay. The sma is a lashon like that. Kan motza balchayv mokem ligbois is chayvay. The idea over here is that this toast was started generations ago. It was gechazet, and it was again repeated a third time. This is, in a nutshell, the story of Mumrim. They make a mistake. They move away from where they're supposed to be, and they become so entrenched, intransigent, committed, in a way that the avla that comes out of them is tremendous. Now, I want to profile two types of mumrim. And with that, I would get to discussing the Miniko Yerushalmi. I want to profile two types of mumrim. Mumrim that were devastating to Klal Yisrael, even though we don't really know them today. These are mumrim that had an effect against Klal Yisrael that was, I would say, staggering bismanam u'be'itam. Today, we don't know karoim. We don't at all understand the effect that Karaim had. But in the time of Rav Sadia Goin, his main battle for the soul of Klal Yisrael was against Karos and Karoim. Today, ask a person, what's a Karoim? We know a little bit about Neir Shabbos, we know a little bit about Halacha, but it's not really such an important issue. In the time of Rav Sadia Goin, he spent the bulk of his 53 years battling Karaim and trying very hard to stop their inroads into the Rabbani Judaism. And that's why today we won't really know a lot about Avner of Borgus. whose name, his Christian name was Alfonso de Walla Walid. I think it's de Walla Walid. I don't know how to say it, but if somebody could correct me, I would be very happy for the correction. But this interesting individual, Avner of Burgos, lived from, I think it was from 1260 to 1347. He lived a very long age. He lived to 87 years. That's a very long time in those days. He was very prolific and very productive. For 60 years of his life, the first 60 years of his life, he was a Rav. One could honestly say he was a sincere, serious Talmud Chacham. The idea of Al Tamin Ba'atzmacha Ad Yom Moischa very much applies to Avner of Burgos. He wrote. There are writings from him in learning, in Torah, and some of the things that he created while he was B'Yahadusai remain as part of our canon. There's an interesting discussion, which one day we'll have, what to do with Chidushim that were crafted from people who eventually went off the derech, who even became goyim. There's a sefer most people don't know. It's called Meitzitz Umeilitz. It's on Birchas Koyanim. It's on Milram Mil'el. It's a diktuk sefer. It's a valid sefer. It has a tremendous amount of information. Nobody knows that Nehemiah HaKohen, the author of that sefer, eventually became a Dominican priest. But the sefer I've seen quoted. There are svarim like that that seem to have made it into our canon, and the people who quote it don't realize that the person who you're quoting happens to be a mumar, le chol hadeis, midoraisa. So that's the same story with Avner of Burgos. Now, the interesting thing about him is he's an important discussion to figure out what exactly turned him at the age of 60 to make that mega commitment. The person doesn't know how long they're going to live. To move at the age of 60 to be a committed Christian. And in that time, from 60 to 87, he wrote 3 very, very, I would say, vile, strong books, at least 3 that are known to me. There might be more, but he wrote a book called Moiret Tzedek, which was written in dialogue form, a dialogue between a Christian teacher and a Jew, trying to show the Jew as hard as he can the truth of Christianity, according to this novice, this newbie Christian's understanding. He wrote another book called Sefer HaChoik, and this was written against the Mesorah of Torah Shebachsav, Torah Shebal Peh. Those of you that heard Rabbi Raful Senior's lecture on Yehuda Arya di Modina will know that Yehuda Arya di Modina wrote a book called Kol Sochel and Shagas Aryeh. Kol Sochel is a polemical argument against the Torah Shebal Peh. Most of those items were lifted from the book called Sefer HaChoik. They were lifted from Avner of Burgos' treaty against Torah Shebal Peh. And that Yehuda Arya di Modina liked, read, and admired. Don't be fooled by reading his Shagas Aryeh and thinking that he was against it. He wasn't. He had these tainis. They were mefafea b'moicha his whole life. And the third book that he wrote was to one of his own Talmidim. He had a Talmud whose name was Yitzchak Tifalkira. He wrote a book called Tshuva Lemecharif. Tshuva Lemecharif, and this was a book about the Emunas Hashilush. He tried to show him the value of the Trinity. Avner of Burgos was a Lamdan. He was Mechadish Nu Chidushim in the Trinity. He showed very interesting concepts. He was a very big believer in determinism. There was no Bechira. Mitzvahs were just directions. They were sort of winds that swayed people towards a direction that the divine desire and will wanted. A lot of his ideas were very enticing to many people in Klal Yisrael who couldn't have any responsibility for that. They were in such bad straits and such bad situations. His idea resonated with a lot of people. I want to show you how powerful Avner was by the amount of svarim that were written to negate his idea, the amount of svarim that were written to battle him. Imagine, we saw B'Yameinu, and again, I never want to say anything negative. I'm not saying anything negative, but we saw B'Yameinu, a couple of years ago when Rabbi Nosson Slifkin wrote a book about science and Torah, and Rabbanim were upset about it, and they came out with articles. Did anybody write a book negating him? I haven't seen anything like that. Yeah, Aviezer, what's his name? Aviezer, but he didn't write anything negating Slifkin. Who is so overwhelmed by a book and so worried about the ramifications of a book that they're sitting down to pen a response and to dedicate, months of short life? Those were short lives. Those weren't like Hobbes said. The life of a peasant was short what did he say? Was hard, short, and difficult. So those were short lives.
Nasty, brutish, and short.
Thank you. Those were short lives, and they were sitting and dedicating powerful, very, very large amounts of time to respond to a book. Yet Avner of Burgus garnered 3, at least that I know of, and there are more. There was a sefer written called Ezer HaEmuna, to help the Ma'aminim, and that was written by Moshe HaKohen Miturlusa. I don't know who he is, but apparently he was a Rishon. He lived in that time. And like we said last time, not everybody who lived in that time was a Rishon, but he had Ikre. It was discovered late. It wasn't something that's been around, and it doesn't pass the test of the Chaznish's Messiah, clearly not. Still, it was written b'Yomov, and it was a very important sefer. The Talmud of Avner of Burgus, whose name was Yitzchak of Falkaira, wrote a sefer called Ezer Hadas, and Rav Shem Tov Ibn Shafrut wrote Even HaBoichen. Each one of these svarim were dedicated to different components of Avner's writing to stop him and to somehow show that he was wrong, to show the offense that he's causing against Klal Yisrael, to show on some level the fact that he misquotes sources and uses them according to how he feels he needs to. Again, what I'm pointing out with this is the effect and the massive impact that this individual had against Klal Yisrael. He was vile, he was strong. He created what I would call the first base of anti-Jewish polemics. Why he became a Catholic is interesting. That's an interesting story. I'll digress for a second. I'll just say why he became a Catholic. There's 3 versions. I could do this, Ellie. Just a slight digression over here. Okay. What caused him to become a Catholic? I'm just thinking, it's a good story, so I'm going to share it for a second. According to his own admission, and for some reason, these people are never trusted. So even when he says exactly what caused him to become a Catholic, we don't believe him. But in one of his books, I think it's in his Tshuva L'Macharif, he writes that everything came to him as a dream. He dreamt repeatedly over and over, and he was called and he was being beckoned by the Catholic religion. And that's why he did what he did. Not very likely. Most historians do not believe that that was the root cause. But the Shalsheles HaKabbalah, which most of you know is called by real historians Shalsheles Kzovim Ushkorim. If you want to look at Eliyahu Del Medigo's Matzref La Chochma, his book on the Teres HaKabbalah, defending but not defend, very interesting book. It deserves a discussion one day. But he has like 4 places where he makes not stam fun.
Yashar Mikandia.
Yashar Mikandia, yeah. His name was Eliyahu Del Medigo. Yeah, Del Medico. Is it Yashar Mikandia? It's the same person. But
yeah.
he
Okay.
That's the same person. Yeah.
It's Candia.
I stand corrected. I've never been there.
The island of Erkalion.
Off Crete. I know where it is
Yeah.
on a map, but we don't call it. It's near Crete. I know.
Yeah.
It's a Greek island.
Yeah.
But somebody want to show on a map? I'm happy to look, but let's just move on. There's a lot to talk on. So again, Yashar makes a lot of fun of the Shalsheles HaKabbalah, and I can tell you that most of the stuff there is not really reliable. So let's just I'll tell you briefly the story. It's a silly story, but apparently, and the timeline doesn't even work, Avner of Burgus was a Talmud of the Ramban, and the Ramban apparently said something to the effect that everybody's name and everybody's future is merumas in the Torah. You could just look and find everything about yourself in the Torah. This seemed to have offended Avner terribly. He looked for himself in the Torah and couldn't find himself. One day, after he was long meshumad, he came to visit the Ramban, and he pulled out a piece of chazer, and he ate it in front of the Ramban, and the discussion was Yom Kippur, and the discussion was, how many krisus is he chayev? He said 4, the Ramban said 5. Debate ensued. The Ramban finally convinced him that he's chayev 5 times chorus. And then the Ramban, in a moment of reflection, asked him, why did he lose the faith? what caused him to bolt like this. And he said, your teaching about me being in the Torah seemed to have bothered me more than I could handle because I'm not in the Torah. The Ramban said, you are, and I'll show you. And he pulled out the pasuk, Amarti, Afeim, Ashbisa, Men, Zichram. Every third letter stands and correlates to Avner, and that's where you are. Okay, this story does nothing for me. The timeline doesn't really work. It's not mistaver that the Ramban would give him that amount of time. What's more logical is the version that historians believe is true, and that has to do with the tshuva in the Rashba, Chelik Aleph, Siman Tov Kuf Mem Ches. It's a very fascinating tshuva and a very interesting story. There are a number of books that detail the history of false messiahs dating back from Shimon Bar Kochva all the way down to modern history, and one of them is somebody by the name of Aleph Zion Eshkoli. He died in the 50s, but it's a great 2-3 volume book that shows all the different false messiahs in history. Another one is a person by the name of Lenowitz, wrote a nice English book. And last but not least is Binyamin Shleima or Shmuel Hamburger, wrote a sefer called Meshichei HaSheker or Misnagdeim. And each of them has this story pretty much in the same fashion. In 1295, this was a number of years before Avner of Burgos became a Meshumid, there was a fellow by the name of Nisim. He lived in Avila. Avila is in central Spain, not far from Madrid. And he was a short, ugly, squat, boorish individual. It's important to know what his physical qualities were. Again, ugly, short, and boorish. Squat, dark, swarthy individual. From poor background, everything was pretty much working against this individual. But he had some charisma. And in his ability, he was able to mesmerize people. And he started saying things that were going to happen in the future. And one or two of his predictions started coming true. He predicted a lot, and therefore it was a very broad net. One or two of his predictions started coming true. He then started writing things, and it seems like it was probably ghostwritten by someone. Eventually, he put out a book called Pilois HaChochma, or Plois HaChochma. It's a very nice, good, catchy name. I don't know that we have it today, but this is the story. And he talked about different, again, eschatological predictions of the future destruction that's going to usher in Mashiach. He talked of dates, he talked of stories, and he ensnared many people. Definitely the Amcha was very, very mesmerized by him. But it got to a point where great people, people that we would call today Rishonim, were also intrigued by him. One of the Rush's principal friends, Don Ben Osher, somebody that the Rashba writes to extensively, was very taken in by Nisim of Avila and felt that he was someone that needs to be listened to. There was only one person in that generation that stood against him and saw the problem and recognized what's going to happen if we're going to buy into this individual. That was the Rashba. The Rashba in Tshuva Tovkuf Memches writes about this Ish Evil Hashoita or Meshuga, and he says there's 3 reasons why you cannot believe in this individual. He says, Aleph, reason number 1, and very important, is because there is a Gemara in Nedarim that says that Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu, I forgot the Lashon, but something like Ein HaKadosh Baruch Hu Mashre, I forgot the Lashon, but the Rabbi Shalom picks to have as a Navi somebody who's an Asher, a Gibar, a tall person, a Chacham, 5 general beautiful qualities, 5 qualities of nobility. He has to be wealthy, he has to be tall, he has to be smart, he has to be good looking. Everything that Nisim of Avila was not. This Gemara is repeated in 2 places, in Sanhedrin, in Nedarim. Everything Nisim of Avila was not, and therefore the Rashba says, I cannot accept that this individual is a Navi. The Rashba asks on himself, he says, 1 second, did not Bilam have a donkey that was somewhat of a Navi? Was not different individuals tapped for Nevuah here and there? Do we not see Ketanim have Nevuah? The Gemara in Baba Basra, Daf Yud Beis. So he answers, he says, they had Nevuah, but Bilam's donkey was not a Navi. Nobody goes to visit the grave of Bilam's donkey thinking that thereby Asoinoi shel Bilam Hanavi. There is no such thing. These individuals on these situations were occurrences for the time, for the person, it was Eirah Shabbat, it does not make them a Navi. Nisim of Avila, therefore, cannot be a Navi. The second reason that the Rashba was offended by him was, he said, we had generations in the time of Shmuel HaKatan, and Daf Yud Aleph, and other times where it said, Roi ben Adam zeh, sheyishra shchina alav. This individual is definitely worthy of the Shechina resting on him. Avalein hadar roi lekach, but the generation isn't roi for this. And he says, how could you think that the time of Shmuel HaNavi, the time of Hillel, they were not roi for Nevuah, but today we are roi for Nevuah? This was the second offense that the Rashba felt the Nisim of Avila was causing. The third one is, he said, it's very simple. In Avila, central Spain, there is no ability for Nevuah to happen. It has to be in Eretz Yisrael. We find Yoina running to Tarshish in order to shirk the mantle of Nevuah out of Eretz Yisrael, out of Nevuah's range. Even Yecheskel, who has Nevuah out of Eretz Yisrael, the Psukim apologized for him. Nahar Kvar, he was already in Eretz Yisrael, and that's why the Nevuah was able to continue resting on him. But Avila was never in Eretz Yisrael. Nisim was never in Eretz Yisrael. And if that be the case, there would be no possibility of him being the Navi. The Rashba therefore concluded this man is a fraud, and anybody that latches onto him will eventually suffer by his fraudulency. And that is what happened. At the day that he designated for arrival of some unbelievable, what we would say, heavenly message, some sort of eschatological, grandiose plan, everybody came. He was never seen again. He escaped, never to be seen again. And there was a tent that was set up with hundreds of seats. On the back of every seat was painted a red cross. No one knows who did it. No one knows how it happened. No one knows where he ended up. The problem is that many of the Jews that were participants of that terrible situation suffered real breakdowns, suffered horrible at this terrible trick. This was a hard time. They were looking forward to something. Avner of Burgus was a young doctor at the time. He treated many people from the residuals and the effects of what happened over there in that city in Avila. He was there. He treated people. He was angry. He understood something to be very wrong. According to most historians, Messianic historians, this seemed to have been the trigger that ultimately sent Avner off the deep end about 25 years later. This anguish was something he never got over. This seemed to have been the trigger. Once again, Avner is a profile of a mumar who doubled down for the rest of his life in what I would say a very depraved and dangerous path for Klal Yisrael. He, I would say, single-handedly started the whole genre of polemics against Jews and polemics against Jewish concepts. Avner of Burgus, very bad mumar. I would also want to discuss Anton Margarita, but I don't have the time for it now, but maybe at some point I will. Anton Margarita is the son of Rav Yaakov Margolis. Rav Yaakov Margolis was one of the Gedolei Hador. His son wrote a book called Das Ganze Yiddische Glaub, the whole Jewish belief. It was recently sold on an auction in Kedem. That book, according to Yosef Luans, who's Yasselman of Rosheim, one of the most famous court Jews in history, is the book responsible for 2 or 3 Girushin, 2 or 3 exiles of many Jews from different villages and provinces in Germany. Not that Germans ever needed help hating Jews, but this book seemed to have put whatever Moshel or ruler in the region over the top, getting the Jews to be thrown out. We'll discuss Anton Margarita in depth. This person's name was Yonason Margolis. Yonason ben Yankov Margolis. His father was one of the Gedolei Hador. Rabbi Yaakov Margolis was the teacher of Rav Yaakov Polak, who was the teacher of Rav Shachna of Lublin, who was the teacher of the Ramah. That's the link of the Mesorah. We'll discuss the type of horror that Anton Margarita brought on Klal Yisrael. There are many other, those of you know Peter Schwartz, Victor von Karbin, those of you might have heard of Jacob von he wasn't a mumar, but there were many other mumrim that were very, very harmful to Klal Yisrael. And we'll discuss them at some point. On the other hand, there were mumrim that were just mumrim in name alone. They were actually good to Klal Yisrael. They actually benefited Klal Yisrael. Now, because time is short, And I do want to show a few svarim tonight. Ellie, I'm going to ask you a housekeeping question. Should I go to the order of what I wanted to do and do the rest next week? I want to profile a mumar that was very decent and show that there is such a thing as a person that gets vachap. And then I want to show that our svarim benefited from one type and was harmed by the other. I go Kasidron.
The Simcha Rabbah, of course.
Okay, fine. You always need a moderator.
Amru Chulam.
Okay. Okay. So I want to talk about an interesting fellow by the name of Ittel Schneer. Rabbi J.J. Greenwald from Columbus, Ohio, profiles him in the Gedolei Ungaria, but there's so much known about him from Chuvas, early Chuvas during the medieval time, the Renaissance times, that he's worth a book, Lemaisa. The only one that I found that profiles him, Barichas, is a person by the name of Osher Ziv. He was a professor in YU, and in the Festrit, or the Sefer HaZikaron for Shmuel Kalman Mirsky, he has an article about Ittel Schneer. I want to tell you some from there and some from some of the Chuvas and some from Greenwald. I want to talk about a mumar that was an amazing, I would say, boon to Klal Yisrael. It starts like this. The Trumas Hadeshin in Tshuva Chaf Aleph says that if let's say a man goes off the derech, he becomes an apostate, he becomes a Catholic. When his children are called to the Torah, they can't be called by his name. That name cannot be mentioned by the Torah. They have to be called by their grandfather. So that's a din that's established by the Sefer Hasidim, brought down by the Trumas Hadeshin, Tshuva Chaf Aleph. The Marim the Maram of Padua, the Chuvas Maram of Padua, one of the first sefer that was published with another sefer. It's his Chuvas published with his grandfather-in-law's Chuvas. The Marim Mintz, together with the Maram of Padua, a Rebbe and a Talmud, a grandfather and a grandson, they published together. Very unique. Maram of Padua was a publisher, so he was able to do things. In Tshuva Pei Zayin, there's a discussion about two boys. The name is Avram and Ephraim. They live in the city of Budan. Budan is Buda of Budapest before it was a united city. It's in Hungary. They live in the city of Budan, also known as Ofan, Budan, Buda, or Budapest today. They live in that city, and they refuse to take an aliyah. From the day that their father became an apostate, they don't want to be called to the Torah because they're embarrassed. They used to be Avram ben Ittel Schneer, Ephraim ben Ittel Schneer. Now they have to go by the name of their grandfather. They don't want an aliyah. These are respectable people. They're already older. They're married men, and they refuse aliyahs. What could we do for them? Could we somehow circumvent that halacha of the Sefer Hasidim and the halacha of the Trumas Hadeshin and give them an aliyah? Now, the Maram of Padua advances three reasons for why that halacha doesn't have to be listened to. And here are the three reasons. He says, first of all, it's embarrassing. And there's a halacha, noyach lo'adam shi'apel esatzmai b'kif sheneish. We know the Gemara in Saita. We know these Gemaras. How could this din even be true? He has a difficulty with the whole din. Why do these poor children of this apostate deserve to be publicly ridiculed? We understand collateral damage. We recognize the need for that. We understand the din of mamzer. But why add new things? Why do they deserve that? That's one. That's a reason that bothers him. Reason number two, he says, is listen, he believes that the whole ruling of the Trumas Hadeshin was only when there was a mumar who went off while his kids were younger. Their kids were never known by his name, so don't bring his name into the Torah. Go right away to the grandfather. But not in a case where you're dislodging somebody's name. Changing a name is a disgusting thing. Not in that case. That's not acceptable. So that's his second, and that actually is brought down in the Ramon, Kuf Lametes. I think Kuf Lametes. Now, and then he goes on and he says something very interesting. You hardly know what he's saying, but he throws out, he says, and you know, this Mumar, their father, Ittel Schneer, not such a bad guy. I heard he's a good guy. I heard he's a Deirish Tev La'amai. And he's very close to the Melucha. He's close to the Hungarian king. They like him. I don't think we should play around with him. I think we should be nice and call him to the Torah. That means his kids should be called by his name to the Torah. So you hear something over here, and it's worthy of some sort of investigation. Who is this Ittel Schneier? Now, the Ramah also has a tshuva. The Ramah is in tshuva Mem Aleph. And the Ramah really wants to fight with the whole ruling, but he doesn't. He ends up agreeing with the Maram Padua. The Maram Padua and the Ramah are related somehow. What's interesting is like this. Ironically, this is a Hungarian story with Paiskim from Italy and Krakow discussing it. The Maram Padua is Italian. The Ramah is Krakow. They're discussing it. And from Kushta comes a tshuva from Rabbi Eliyahu Halevi. Rabbi Eliyahu Halevi wrote a sefer called Zikan Aaron. It's a Sephardic Shemeshit, not a very well-known sefer, and he writes something very fascinating. He reveals to us a tremendous amount of background about this story. So it takes a Sephardi to give us all the information. It's like almost like a tell-all tshuva. So first he writes like this. He says, listen, this guy, he just focuses on the guy. He's not a bad guy at all. He says, this guy, I could tell you so many things about him. And he goes out to list 7 stories about him. And he says, this guy's a bad guy? This guy's a remarkable guy. The fact that he became a mumar, he couldn't help it. And you know, you start learning the story. He was a good-looking man. He was very charismatic. He did a lot of business. And he became indiscreet with a woman, a Hungarian noblewoman. The unfortunate reality is that they made you, when you came back, after your sin was known, they made you shave your hair completely bald. Take off your beard, take off your hair. This, according to the Marshal in Hachoivel, is a embarrassment larger than losing a limb. He says people would often prefer to lose a limb than to be shorn like that publicly. The shavings were very interesting tools, and we could talk a lot about it. Aaron Chorin was a subject of such a decree, and that's possibly what pushed him off to make him the neolog that he was. It was decreed upon him that he should have himself completely shorn. Now, the interesting thing is like this: is that, and they were relentless. Hungarian Jewry was relentless. They wanted that he should shave because he was indiscreet. That's the story, and he refused to. He was a prominent person. His beard meant a lot to him, and he wasn't going to allow it to be taken off. Those of you that ever followed the Mormon story of the beard shavings will listen to the court records about the prosecution talking about how people who have their beards forcefully taken away from them, it's like taking away their identity. It's a hate crime. Well, this is what Ittel Schneier felt also. So he said no, and in his stubbornness, he ended up becoming an apostate. Rabbi Eliyahu Halevi in this Zikan Aaron says, that's not called an apostate. That's someone who was pushed over the brink. That's not an apostate. And we don't call that apostasy. And Adarabba, we should help him do tshuva. And he says, and I'll prove it to you because I'll show you so many things that this person involved himself in. And one of them is like this. He says, there was a famous axiom by one of the cardinals about Jewish converts. They used to say Jewish converts are like sparrow dung. They come out very hot, but they cool off very quickly. We have a Gemara like that, Koshim Gerim Yisrael Kesapachas. We know exactly what that means. But he said it a little with a little cleverness. It's like sparrow dung. Now, and they said this about Ittel Schneier also. They said that within the first year of his conversion, a mob gathered around his house with an effort to burn it. They said that he wasn't really a convert. They said he was always just operating for the welfare and the betterment of his old co-religionist. He was eventually the treasurer of the Hungarian government. He became very prominent, but he was always trying to affect good outcome for the Jewish people. His Gentile name was Imre Serenchesh. His baptism was presided upon by the King of Hungary. Still, his focus was always the Jewish people. That was the first thing. The second thing this Zikan Aaron said is that, and this is interesting to me, there was a fellow in Hungary that tried to foment a mob against the Jewish neighborhood, saying that they use blood of Gentiles for matzah. This fellow was Jewish once, but he had a vile hatred for his co-religionists. It looked like the local constabulary was going to believe this fellow and they were going to sanction a mob. I guess they had the Blasios then also. And what happened was that Ittel Schneier got involved And he was able to convince the king of the fallacy of blood libel. And the king was so convinced that he said, okay, take this guy and do what you want with him. And Ittel Shneur delivered him to the Jewish ghetto, and the guy was beaten to death. This Malshin was beaten to death. This is recorded in the Zakan Aaron Shuvat Tzadikei. Number 3, he heard about a Bohemian expulsion, an expulsion that was going to take place in Bohemia, and he paid his own money to stop that expulsion. Number 4, a Jewish thief was caught and he was sentenced to death for recidivist type of criminality, and Shneur redeemed him. He was released to his own custody, and he helped spare the guy's life. Number 5, very interesting story, 5. A fellow became a Catholic. He had 2 children, a boy and a girl. One was 2, one was 3. He took them and he converted them. He died 2 years later. Shneur, finding out that the 2 children were without parents, went to them, took them into his own custody, brought them to a good Jewish family, and said, these are Jews, raised them as Jews, and they ended up being 2 prominent Jews in a community in Buda. He obviously cares about Jews, Judaism, and Jewishness. Number 6 is very fascinating. The last thing he does, and this is what Zakan Aaron says, is as he's ready to die, he hobbles into the big shul in Budapest. And he stands by the bima, being that he's respectable. They all gave him the time, the chance, and the opportunity. And he announces his sins publicly, and he confesses in front of a whole community, and he asks to sit right by the front of an open Aron Kodesh, and he dies. And right before he dies, he asks that they say Kaddish for him. According to Greenwald, the tradition was, for many years, that there was a Kaddish after Kol Nidre that was said, L'zeichen nishmosai of Ittel Shneur. This terrible mummer. Zakan Aaron says, this is not a mummer. This is a great guy. Call him up by his name. Call Ephraim ben Ittel Shneur, Avram ben Ittel Shneur, and nothing more to be discussed about it. And what's interesting is he goes on to talk a little further. He says, I'm even suspicious, maybe we should call him Ephraim ben Reb Ittel Shneur. Avram ben Rebit, I would even want to give him the Rav. And he says, you know why? And let me just preface this with a little story I had with my father's Rosh Hashiva, Zechat Tzadik U'Bracha, Rabbi Scheinberg. Rabbi Chaim Pinchas Scheinberg used to ask me to write haskamas for him for American Mechabrim. If somebody wanted to write a sefer in America and he needed a haskamas, he'd say, call Plutchok, you could write for me. I knew what he wanted to say. I had an idea of how he wanted to write. So one time a fellow wrote a sefer, and Rabbi Scheinberg interviewed him, and he wasn't overwhelmed by his godless batayra. But I said, Ikla lekamon, Hai Gavra, Hey Reish, Hey Gimel, which stands for Harav Hagoyim. V'tachrich ksavim b'yodav, he's got a whole bunch of writings in his hand, and he wanted me. So he looks at me and he says, Moshe, Istaka Harav Hagoyim? You wrote Harav Hagoyim, Istaka Hagoyim? And I didn't know what to say, but, to write less is not nice. So I say, Rebbe, maybe it says Harav Haganef. It's Hey Reish, Hey Gimel. Maybe it says Harav Hagazlin. Maybe it says Harav Hagargar. And he was laughing. I have to tell you, he was laughing. And he says, okay, leave it. Okay, leave it. I understood from this that when Mechabrim spell out Hey Reish, Hey Gimel is much different than when they say Harav Hagoyim. Hey Reish, Hey Gimel is not Harav Hagoyim. So what the Zakan Aaron says over here is like this. I'm ready to call him Reb also. Because Reb doesn't mean a Rebbe to people. You find that Rish Lakish, when he was upset at Rav Yochanan Kayadua was Mekar of Rish Lakish, and he brought him Tachas Kamfei Ashchina. And then in the middle, they had an argument in the Beis Medrash where Rav Yochanan asked Rish Lakish flippantly a question about a knife. When is a knife considered a knife? And Rish Lakish says, Maya Hanili, Mikara Korele Rebbe. The thieves used to call me Rebbe, Vahashta Korele Rebbe. So you see, Rebbe just means a term of skipper, master, great one. Doesn't mean rabbi. He says Rish Lakish was called Rebbe while he was a thief. And he says, you see, there's a Gemara in Gittin Daf Nun Zayin. He says, such a Gemara. It says, Maise be'echad. It says, Maise be. Maisa be'echad shenasan einav be'eshes Rabbi b'shulya denagri hoya. There was a story about a guy who coveted his master's wife, Rabbi, and he was a shulya denagri. He was just an apprentice. The rabbi, the teacher, was the master. He was just the apprentice in the guild. So you see the word, and all the rabbis by Eved, Mishachetzi Eved v'chetzi ben Chayrin, Rabbi gives him a shivcha, Rabbi gives, you see all that. Rabbi. He says, I'm comfortable, call him Reb also. It doesn't mean rabbi, it means master, it means great one, it means leader, it means skipper. The conclusion is that Itul Shnei's family became completely absorbed in the mainstream of Klal Yisrael due to all these Meshivim's benevolent understanding, and what you could honestly say was the fact that he was a very good mummer. So we profile two types of mumrim tonight.
It sounds like they actually approved of what he did. Was it actually that?
They definitely approved of his actions, but his mumras, nobody approved of. The fact that he took on a baptismal procession with the name Imri Serenchesh, and he lived as a Catholic, he went to church, no one could sanction that. Not the Marim Padua, not the Ramon, not the Skan Aaron, not the Siddim, none of the Meshivim would sanction that. They understood that the Ora and the Choshech were Meshamshin Baravuvio. They recognized that there was light and there was dark over here. And this individual had spots. He had streaks of greatness. He had streaks of darkness. But it doesn't mean that he's an Upgefrechter. And they took him in. I will talk one time at a later date about Aaron Chorin and show that did not happen for him. And that's one of the reasons that as Jews, we suffered a division which we didn't recover from. This was the Mahalach. When you look at these individuals and I would say the greatness of their humanism, the depth of their understanding, there was something over here that should teach us a lekach l'doros. I will show in Eretz Hashem next week the two types of censors that operated on our books. Just before we go, I'll show you. Here's censor number one. This is a kolboy, and this was printed in the year Shin Zayin, which is 1547. You could see from the Sharblat, I believe you could see it. It was printed in Venice in 1547, and I could show you what a censor looks like when he's actually very dedicated to his work. For example, this is Hilchas Avodas Kechavim. I don't know if you could see how many crossouts there are. You barely could learn this page because there's so many erasures. Censors were often known to use burning irons, which actually burnt the page on both sides. Here's another page that this individual went crazy on, right? And there's, I would say, hundreds of erasures in this sefer. This was a very, very strict censor. Most of the censors were mumrim. This fellow's name was Mr. Farini. They signed their name at the end of the book. All of them signed their name and they dated at the end of the book. On the other hand, there was a censor who censored, I would say, more books than anyone. His name was Domenico Yerushalmi. It's a very interesting name. Now, I don't know if you could read it, but that says Domenico Yerusalomo. Can you read it? Sometimes he signs it in Hebrew. Sometimes he signs it in Latin letters.
Yeah, it's very clear.
Domenico Yerusalomo. Okay?
1797.
Right. Now, this was a fellow whose name was Shmuel Bibas. I'll talk about him next week. Shmuel Bibas lived in Tzfas. He was a Dayan. He was a frum Jew till his 39th birthday. He sat on courts. He was during the time of the Beis Yosef. What caused him to go off is unknown, but I could tell you he never touched a book. There's no erasure in Kemat any of the Sfarim that he signs, which in my mind seems to indicate that he was a benevolent individual in his mumras.
Where did he work?
He worked in Rome. Most of them, they worked in Rome. They were Vatican censors. All the books that are censored for the most part are in Italy. So you see over here is another book. This is a Shalos Chuvas Maram in Rutenberg. Shin Yud Beis in Cremona, Domenico Yerusalomo. Nothing is touched in the book. He did over, I would say, 16,000 Sfarim have his name. He's the most ubiquitous, prolific censor. I'll make an argument that he was from the ilk of Itul Shneier. I'll make an argument that Paul Jacob Margolin, who is the great nephew of the Shagasaryeh, is from the Avner of Bourgouse style. And we'll talk more next time how he puts this together. Thank you so
Right,
much.
They didn't catch on.
How
They
did
didn't
he,
catch on to him.
I can't
Rabbi,
hear. David.
The church didn't catch on to this guy. How they didn't notice that he doesn't quote
Oh.
something else.
That's a good question. No. They didn't look. A censor had a certain right. Also, you have to know that when we'll talk on censorship, there were some popes that were vile, that were very, very, I would say, machmir on censorship, and others didn't care that much at all. And then I'll tell you another thing. The Bamberg Talmud was never censored. There were certain popes that understood that stuff that's from within them doesn't need censorship. I'll discuss I would say, theory of censorship at a time we could elaborate on it.
Rabbi, would you call the Israelis a good example of benevolent mumras?
Israelis?
Yeah, the Disraeli family, Benjamin and his dad.
The Israeli. Yeah. The Israeli, yes. The Israeli was. That's a great story. Again, Isaac Disraeli, father of Benjamin, went off because he was pushed out. If you read the biography on Benjamin Disraeli, you'll learn that Isaac wasn't a bad guy. He was just a jerk. He was like what you call a deadbeat. And because I think it was Benjamin the Senior, who was the Earl of Beaconsfield, was so prominent in the synagogue, and Isaac didn't want to take a spot, they didn't allow Benjamin's bar mitzvah to happen in the shul. As a result, Isaac became an Anglican. Benjamin was probably the best prime minister for the Jewish people. He wrote a couple of novels profiling the beauty of the Jewish nation.
Daniel Durand.
Oh, very good. Okay, listen, we could talk. There's an arichas. We can talk.
I'm just wondering, how did these censors actually happen? Each after all the whole batch of books was printed, then he would go through each book blotting out lines?
Okay, so there's a fellow in the late 1800s. I'm just blocking on his name. His name is Popper. So he explains. I think that you needed to have an okayed book in order to own it. Nobody ever checked, but if you were caught without the okay of the censorship, it would be contraband. I think Popper explains that's how the censorship worked.
So you would get a hold of a book from wherever, and you would have to bring it.
You'd have to bring it to the censor, who would. So it could be that Domenico Yerushalmi was just lazy and didn't want to go through his files, just sign off on it easy. Jews are lazy that way. Or it could be that he was a scholar and he knew what's going to be already in the Maran Rutenberg. Not clear. But in any event, what he left us was okay. He left us alone. Right. It's a nice thing to being left alone.
And then there are other Sfarim, I guess, that were censored at the printing press, meaning that, right, like the Gemara's missing lines, right?
Right. There was self-censorship. Right. There was self-censorship. Correct. The Basel Shas and the Zolzbach Shas. We'll talk on it. I'll discuss it the next time we're together. I would like to talk a lot on that.
Okay, Yasher Koyach, thank you so much. And so Be'ezer Hashem do next Tuesday night. We'll confirm on that. Okay. Thank you everybody for coming. And tomorrow night we'll have my father giving a shir on Targum Mishlei. Same time, 9 o'clock.
Very good.
Okay, thank you everybody for coming. Well, too.
Thank you.
Thank you. Good night.
Thanks. Yeah, that's all right. Thank you. Thank you.